The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Arthur, when you're ready to begin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our PDO series webinar this afternoon, or this morning, I guess, in the West Coast. Today's presenter is Jamie Burchard-Thoman, AICP CFM. Jamie is a senior planner at the Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council in Rochester, New York, where she is providing comprehensive planning support for a 9-county region for over 8 years. Jamie's focus areas are general municipal, water resources, and historic preservation planning. Water resources planning includes stormwater regulation assistance, watershed and floodplain management planning, and public communication and community outreach. She began her career at CADD GIS analysis at Dewberry in Fairfax, Virginia, where she worked on the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program contract, participated in FEMA's Public Assistance Program during active hurricane seasons and the 2001 World Trade Center disaster. Other work experiences include environmental planning and cultural resource documentation on Long Island, New York. Jamie graduated from Mary Washington College in 2000 with a dual Bachelor's of Arts in Historic Preservation and Geography, and Cornell University with a Master of Arts in Historic Preservation Planning in 2005. Jamie and her husband Dave welcomed their first child back in March, and she enjoys teaching indoor cycling at her local YMCA, and it's also Jamie's birthday today, so happy birthday, Jamie, and take on your show there. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. Well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be presenting today. Floodplain management is a multidisciplinary field involving a variety of areas such as emergency management, public administration, and public works. I think planning plays a big role in hazard mitigation, especially with community communication and citizen involvement. I'd like to begin with a summary of today's goals. First, we'll discuss the history of federal disaster policy and how the early stages of flood hazard mitigation came about as structural measures. In more recent years, federal disaster assistance has increased and focus has been given to land use planning and regulation, land acquisition, flood prediction and warning, and flood insurance. Next, we'll examine the flood insurance provisions of the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 and the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014. Lastly, we'll review solutions to reducing flood losses. Flood exposure continues to increase in communities across the country. We'll focus on the community planning process and primary planning implementation tools such as zoning and other land use regulations to manage development that can contribute to increased flood risk. Before we move into the review of flood disaster policy, I'd like to take this opportunity and introduce participants to the role of regional planning councils. Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council, GFL-RPC, is one of 9 locally created regional planning boards in New York State. We are located in West Central New York and bordered by Lake Ontario to the north, the Southern Tier region to the south, Syracuse and the Central New York region to the east, and the Buffalo-Niagara metropolitan area to the west. The New York State Association of Regional Councils, NYSARC, represents 45 of the state's 62 counties. GFL-RPC was established in 1977 by a joint resolution approved by its 8 original member counties, including Genesee, Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, Orleans, Seneca, Wayne, and Yates. Wyoming County was admitted in 1986. The council was organized under Articles 5G and 12B of the New York State General Municipal Law, which recognizes intermunicipal cooperation. Regional councils do not have the power to tax or to regulate. Our primary program components include local, regional, and water resources planning, regional economic development planning, and a data, technology, and resource center. My focus area is water resources planning, which includes federal Phase 2 stormwater regulation assistance, participation with county water quality coordinating committees, stormwater and floodplain management planning, watershed planning, and watershed plan implementation. The Genesee Finger Lakes region is composed of 9 counties and 190 cities, towns, and villages. According to Census 2010, the population of the region was about 1.2 million. Monroe County has the highest total population with about 744,000, and Yates County has the lowest total population with about 25,000. The city of Rochester, which is the region's largest city, has a total population of about 210,000. New York State is a home rule state. In home rule states, an amendment to the state constitution grants local governments the ability to pass laws to govern themselves as they see fit, so long as they obey the state and federal constitutions. The powers granted in the Bill of Rights for local governments of the Constitution and implementation by the Municipal Home Rule Law give authority to cities, towns, and villages to act by local law with respect to its property, affairs, or government. Today's webinar focuses on the land use context, which is the Home Rule authority to pass local laws related to zoning, planning, land development, and natural resource conservation. Here are the 1% annual chance flood zones in the GFL region. Some areas to highlight are the Genesee River Valley, the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge, and the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, with portions of the Erie Canal. We also have the Finger Lakes, Braddock Bay Fish and Wildlife Management Area along Lake Ontario, and Sodus Bay and the Lake Shore Marshes Wildlife Management Area. Q3 flood data files, which are derived from the flood insurance rate maps, are not available for Seneca or Yates counties. Although the history of the United States is marked by fire, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, and hurricanes, generally the people residing in the location affected did not count on government financial support or expertise to help repair the damage. Not until the 20th century did the public call for an increasing amount of federal responsibility, which led to widespread government intervention. In its early years, the federal government's outlook on natural disasters was a laissez-faire approach. Disasters were viewed as unavoidable events where recovery was the moral responsibility of neighbors, churches, charities, and communities. However, when the lower Mississippi River broke through its levees in 1927, the role and responsibilities of local government in the control of floods came into question. Soon after, the Lower Mississippi Flood Control Act of 1928 and its successors in 1936, 1937, and 1938 turned a local problem into a federal responsibility. The first approach of mitigation, historically, has been structural. The 1936 Flood Control Act defined flooding as a nationally significant problem, warranting federal involvement, and included the principle of cost sharing with local interests. It authorized hundreds of flood control projects, dams, levees, and channels. The Federal Disaster Relief Act of 1950 was the nation's first general disaster assistance law. The benefits of the Federal Disaster Assistance Program, however, were limited to local public costs and only authorized, 1, the utilitarian or loan to states and governments of federal equipment, supplies, facilities, personnel, and other resources, 2, distribution of food and medicine through the American Red Cross, 3, donation of surplus federal property to states and local governments, and 4, performing on public or private lands protective and other work essential for the preservation of life and property, clearing debris and wreckage, making emergency repairs to and temporary replacement of public facilities of local governments damaged or destroyed in such major disaster. Federal disaster assistance was housed within a series of civil defense agencies, although being initially assigned to the Housing and Home Finance Agency, which administered the Federal Urban Renewal Program launched in 1949. In 1974, it returned to the arena of community planning under the newly created Federal Disaster Assistance Administration, established within the Department of Housing and Urban Development. From there, in 1979, it was transferred to the new Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which was a combination of civilian and military preparedness programs established by President Jimmy Carter via executive order. FEMA was the lead agency for federal programs under the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, which established the federal government as the permanent and primary source of funds and expertise to deal with various levels of disasters. The recent era of disaster mitigation policy in the United States began with the passage of the National Flood Insurance Act in 1968, which created the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. Congress enacted the NFIP primarily because flood insurance was unavailable from the private insurance markets following frequent widespread flooding along the Mississippi River in the early 1960s. Additionally, Hurricane Betsy of 1965 was the first storm in U.S. history to cause over $1 billion in flood damage. Most victims did not have access to flood insurance because flooding had been dropped from most homeowners' policies. At the time, the NFIP was administered by Department of Housing and Urban Development and based on voluntary community participation. Through state enabling legislation, it required floodproofing through local building codes and elevated structures in return for federally subsidized flood insurance. Interest in the voluntary program was weak, so community participation was made mandatory with the passage of the Flood Disaster Protection Act in 1973. The NFIP is now managed by FEMA. Participation in the NFIP is based on an agreement between communities and FEMA. The NFIP has three basic components. The first, to develop maps of flood hazard zones. The second, to improve floodplain management. And the third, to provide flood insurance. Let's briefly review each. Floodplain mapping. NFIP participation requires the community to adopt flood hazard maps called flood insurance rate maps, FIRM. They provide the data needed to administer floodplain management programs at the local level, including building standards, and to actuarially rate new construction for flood insurance. Floodplain management. The NFIP requires communities to adopt and enforce minimum federal floodplain management regulations that help mitigate the effects of flooding on new and improved structures. States and communities may have more restrictive elements in their floodplain ordinances to provide additional safety measures. Flood insurance. Community participation in the NFIP enables property owners to purchase insurance as a protection against flood losses in exchange for community floodplain management regulations that reduce future flood damages. So residents can purchase flood insurance if their community has adopted FEMA's FIRM and adopted and approved, usually the state model, flood damage prevention local law or ordinance. So the concept of the NFIP was flood insurance would be made available to the people via the federal government if local governments would adopt and enforce measures to make future construction safer from flooding. So let's ask the question, is it working? Despite what has been done and the money that has been spent this century, damages continue to go up. Floods are the leading cause of natural disaster losses in the United States, having cost approximately $50 billion in property damage in the 1990s and accounting for more than 2/3 of federally declared natural disasters. Direct average annual flood damages have jumped from approximately $5.6 billion per year in the 1990s to nearly $10 billion per year in the 2000s. Since 2000, the nation has experienced many large flood events, including the hurricanes of 2004, Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, which was followed by Hurricane Wilma in 2005, Hurricane Ike in 2008, the Midwest floods of 2008 and 2010, and the major flooding of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in 2011. Additional events like Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee devastated Pennsylvania, New York, and New England during September 2011. And in late October 2012, a large tropical storm that developed into a nor'easter, labeled Superstorm Sandy, devastated the mid-Atlantic coast, damaging more than 100,000 structures. Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy occurred within 7 years of each other and were the two largest flood-related disasters in U.S. history, which, when combined, resulted in more than $2 billion in direct damages. Prior to 2005, the NFIP was largely self-supporting. Premiums paid for claims and administration. During periods of high losses, consistent with the law, the NFIP has borrowed from the U.S. Treasury. These loans have been repaid with interest from policyholder premiums and related fees, at no cost to the nation's taxpayers. This was until 2005, when Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma created over $15 billion in claims and sunk the program in debt. Along came Hurricane Sandy, and the program had accumulated over $24 billion of debt. Two things to note about the NFIP. The policy structure was not set up to handle extreme events, especially as they become more routine. And the NFIP has never been capitalized, meaning unlike a private insurer, the NFIP is designed to operate with a Treasury borrowing authority to supplement the premium income in times of heavier losses. The borrowing limit has not kept pace with the increasing policy base. So with the costs and consequences of flooding continuing to increase, and for the NFIP to remain sustainable, its premium structure had to reflect the true risks and costs of flooding. This was a primary driver for Congress to make changes to the NFIP. On July 6, 2012, President Obama signed into law the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012, BW12, which reauthorized the NFIP through September 30, 2017, and made a number of reforms aimed at making the program more financially and structurally sound. The purpose of the legislation was to change the way the NFIP operates and to raise rates to reflect true flood risk, as well as make the program more financially stable. We'll be reviewing sections 205 and 207 of BW12. This is a summary slide of section 205. Let's break down the first sentence. For pre-firm subsidized rated buildings in a special flood hazard area, SFHA, or Zone D. A pre-firm building was built before the community's first firm became effective. It has not been substantially damaged or improved, which means the cost of repairing or improving the building does not equal or exceed 50% of the building's market value, excluding the land value. These structures have been paying a subsidized rate and do not reflect true risk or the actuarial rate. The SFHA is the 1% annual chance flood, or 100-year flood zone, typically labeled as Zone A or Z on a firm. Zone D is an unmapped area. The old definition under BW12 for a non-primary residence is a building that will be lived in for less than 80% of the policy year by the policyholder. The definition has since been revised. A non-residential building is basically commercial use, and a severe repetitive loss property has at least 4 NFIP claim payments, including building and contents, over $5,000 each, and the cumulative amount of such claim payments exceeds $20,000. Under BW12, these properties would see a 25% annual increase until subsidized rates reflect true risk. Primary residence owners would also be impacted by BW12 if they are pre-firm and located in a SFHA, unless or until the building was sold, a new policy was purchased, or a policy was allowed to lapse. Rates were anticipated to increase about 16 to 17%. This section phased out grandfathered rates and moved properties to risk-based rates if and when the community adopted a new firm. Grandfathering allows a lower cost flood insurance rating option to property owners who have flood insurance policies in effect when they are newly mapped into a high-risk area and have maintained continuous coverage, or when buildings were in compliance with the firm in effect at the time of construction. So if you lived in a community that adopted a new updated firm, grandfathered rates would begin to be phased out. This was proposed to happen gradually, with new rates increasing by 20% per year for 5 years. A separate discount, the preferred risk policy eligibility extension, would also be discontinued when the new grandfathering provisions were to be implemented. The preferred risk policy eligibility extension allows people newly mapped into a high-risk area to temporarily retain lower-cost preferred risk rates. As implementation moved forward, concerns over flood insurance premium increases prompted legislative efforts to modify some of BW12 reforms. Originally, BW12 was supposed to gradually phase out subsidized rates for about 20% of property owners. 80% of NFIP policyholders nationally are already actuarially rated. Half would pay 25% more per year, while the rest move to the full risk rate upon the purchase of an older property. However, FEMA did not issue the new rates for 15 months, allowing many to buy the property before they could be warned of a retroactive rate increase. Others saw inaccurate rate quotes well above the intended 25% increases. Most of these insurance rating discrepancies appear to be the result of confusion caused by implementation of 2012 law. On March 21, 2014, President Obama signed the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014, HFIAA, which repeals and modifies certain BW12 provisions and makes additional program changes to other aspects of the NFIP. The new law slows some flood insurance rate increases and offers relief to some policyholders who experienced steep flood insurance premium increases in 2013 and early 2014. Flood insurance rates and other charges will be revised for new or existing policies beginning on April 1, 2015. Primary residence owners that are pre-firm and located in a SFHA will now see their premiums increase by no less than 5 to 15% annually within a single risk class, but no more than 18% annually for an individual policyholder. This rate increase will occur annually until the class premium reaches its full risk rate. Refunds can also be expected of the difference paid between the subsidized rate and the current full risk rate. FEMA is working with participating insurance companies to start the refund process by the end of this year. Refunds will apply to policyholders in high-risk areas who are required to pay their full risk rate after purchasing a new flood insurance policy on or after July 6, 2012. Refer to FEMA's resource and document library for the brochure entitled Flood Insurance Premium Refunds, Who Gets Them, Who Does Not, for more information. Exceptions to these rules include policies for the following properties, which will continue to see up to 25% annual increases as required by BW12 until they reach their full risk rate. Older business properties insured with subsidized rates, older non-primary residences insured with subsidized rates, under the new definition, which is pre-firm structures occupied more than 50% of the year, severe repetitive loss properties, and buildings that have been substantially damaged or improved. Those structures where the total cost of repairs or improvement is 50% or more of the structure's market value before the disaster occurred. Local governments make the determination of substantially damaged or improved structures via a letter of determination. Refer to FEMA's Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk reference. 2014 legislation also restores FEMA's ability to grandfather properties into lower risk classes and reinstates preferred risk policy rates, which sets first-year premiums at the same rate offered to properties located outside the special flood hazard area. With limited exceptions, flood insurance premiums cannot increase more than 18% annually. In order to offset these lower flood insurance rate increases for subsidized policies while achieving the financial sustainability goals of BW12, a new surcharge will be added to all policies. A policy for a primary residence will include a $25 surcharge. All other policies will include a $250 surcharge. The fee will be included on all policies, including full risk rated policies, until all pre-firm subsidies are eliminated. The first step to take in response to recent legislation is answering questions. An even better approach would be not waiting for questions and reaching out to residents and businesses to advise them of flood hazards in the community, what the community is doing about it, and what they can do to protect themselves. Recommend agents that are knowledgeable about the NFIP and can help identify mitigation options. Use the agent locator at floodsmart.gov. Recommend that the policy be rated on the elevation certificate. The higher the lowest floor elevation is above the base flood elevation, the lower the risk and typically lower the rate. This could be lower than the subsidized pre-firm rate. To learn the building's elevation, the owner will need to obtain an elevation certificate. With an elevation certificate, the agent can calculate the full risk rate. Various mitigation options are available, such as elevating utilities, installing flood vents in the garage or crawl space, and filling in the basement. Convert the lowest floor to unfinished space with flood-resistant materials or elevate the structure. Unfinished space is used only for storage, building access, or parking vehicles. Dry floodproofing for non-residential buildings can lead to lower rates. If an engineer certifies that the design, construction methods, and materials make the building watertight to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, the BFE. The higher above the BFE it can be certified, the lower the rates. To obtain the rating credit, the design professional must complete a floodproofing certificate form. Outreach projects can also include brochures set out in public places, mailing a notice to flood-prone property owners or to everyone in the community. Some communities send the notice annually with tax notices. Displays in public buildings or shopping malls, articles and special sections in newspapers, and presentations to neighborhood, civic, or business groups. Which brings us to the third component of this webinar. What can a planner do? Development activity within communities continues to induce flood damages, even while compliant with the minimum standards of the NFIP. Planners are more inclined to look at long-term consequences of current actions in terms of the built environment, economic development, and social equity. We are looking to reduce costs due to floods. Some of those costs include decreased tax income, post-flood cleanup and repair, loss of jobs, and risk of injury. Flood insurance can also be a cost. More than likely, premiums will continue to increase along with mapped floodplains. Even areas outside the mapped floodplain will likely flood due to development in the watershed and increased storm events. Our goal as planners is to help reduce these costs through mitigation. The first step would be a quick inventory and assessment via GIS analyst. First, find out how many structures are located in the special flood hazard area or the 1% annual chance flood. Find out how many policies are in force. You can check the FEMA website for that information. Next, figure out how many of those structures were built before the firm was adopted by the municipality. You can do this by checking the community status book report to pinpoint when the initial firm was identified for a particular community. That might help establish a baseline. In order to identify pre-firm structures, use local tax assessment information and the year of construction. The next step would be the collection of related flood hazard data, such as wetlands, soils susceptible to flooding and ponding, groundwater aquifers, and species and habitats. Detailed maps help guide development, prepare plans for community economic growth and infrastructure, utilize the natural and beneficial function of floodplains, and protect private and public interests. Basically, any indicators that point towards potential flooding. I'm sure attendees on this webinar have family, friends, or neighbors that have experienced flooding, even outside of mapped floodplains, which is why a community should have this extra data available and mapped. This fact-finding is what builds support for substantial evidence. This is what allows local government regulations to exceed both state and federal regulations, those minimum NFIP standards, which we'll discuss next. A municipality is more likely to be sued for issuing a permit for development that causes harm than for denying a permit based on hazard prevention or no adverse impact regulations. No adverse impact floodplain management is an approach that ensures the action of any community or property owner, public or private, does not adversely impact the property or rights of others. The likelihood of a successful lawsuit against a municipality for issuing a permit increases if the permitted activity results in substantial flood, erosion, or other physical damage to other private property owners. So build your case for more stringent standards by collecting data. One of the shortcomings of the NFIP minimum mapping criteria is that maps become outdated as watersheds develop. As land, such as farms and forests, are converted to impervious surfaces, the amount of stormwater runoff increases, resulting in a corresponding increase in downstream flood heights and frequency. Fill is defined as material from any source, including the subject property, placed that raises the ground, the natural grade, to or above the base flood elevation, the 1% annual chance flood. The floodway is the central portion of a riverine floodplain needed to carry the deeper, faster-moving water. Buildings, structures, and other development activities, such as fill, placed within the floodway are more likely to obstruct flood flows, causing the water to slow down and back up, resulting in higher flood elevations. All projects in the regulatory floodway must undergo an encroachment review to determine their effect on flood flows and ensure that they do not cause problems. Floodway fill is allowed only if an engineering study and the floodplain administrator can determine if no rise in the flood level will occur. This is part of the NFIP minimum standards. The community may conduct the encroachment review, or the developer may be required to conduct it. Most local permit officials are not qualified to make an encroachment review, so they require that this be done by an engineer at the developer's expense. Development projects in the flood fringe, by definition, do not increase flood heights above the allowable level, so encroachment reviews are not needed. However, floodplains are supposed to store floodwater. If storage space is filled with dirt and other material, future flooding may worsen. Floodplain fill can alter other functions besides backwater, including wildlife habitats and wetlands. FEMA publishes letters of map amendment, LOMA, letters of map revision, LOMER, and letters of map revision based on fill, LOMAR-F. Collectively, these letters are called letters of map change. Due to limited funds for mapping, FEMA has used LOMAs to document clarifications of map interpretations, and LOMARs and LOMAR-Fs to document physical changes that would cause a map to be modified. The community acknowledgement form must be completed for all requests involving the placement of fill, existing or proposed, or requests for land or structures that are inadvertently included in the NFIP regulatory floodway. The form must be completed and signed by the community official responsible for floodplain management in the community. Since FEMA's regulations allow for the placement of fill in the flood fringe, a portion of the natural floodway will, over time, be obstructed by development, causing a real increase in the BFE of 1 foot. This adversely impacts properties already subject to flooding and extends the boundary of a floodplain to new areas. In flat country, the floodplain boundary can be extended outward several blocks, subjecting many more properties in the area to flooding and regulation. Unfortunately, the flood elevation profile shown on the firm and used to guide development is the lower elevation, not the 1 foot rise, putting development at certain risk. Not allowing the base flood elevation to increase over time goes a long way toward not allowing adverse impacts on others. It should be noted that these higher mapping standards do not prevent development. No rise does not mean no development. It means that development must be more careful about its impacts on others. Instead of assuming that existing or proposed structures in an area can absorb a 1 foot increase in the base flood, a no-rise floodway means that a development cannot cause any increase in flood heights that will adversely affect others. An alternative to mapping floodways to a different standard is treating the entire floodplain as a floodway. Floodway standards are in effect across the entire floodplain, and no development is allowed that would result in any increase in the base flood. This approach will be discussed later in higher regulatory standards. Most successful planning efforts begin with a survey of existing conditions and a determination of the municipality's vision for the future. This process is usually referred to as comprehensive planning. A comprehensive plan should be thought of as a blueprint upon which zoning and other land use regulations are based. Mitigation plans form the foundation for a community's long-term strategy to reduce long-term risk from natural hazards and disasters. It creates a framework for risk-based decision-making to reduce damages to lives, property, and the economy from future disasters. State and local governments must prepare a multi-hazard mitigation plan as a precondition for receiving FEMA mitigation project grants. Local hazard mitigation plans should be linked to other community planning activities, particularly land use planning. The most important is that, unlike the comprehensive plan, the local hazard mitigation plan has no legal status for guiding local decision-making regarding capital expenditures or land use. Although it varies from state to state when issues arise regarding consistency of land use regulations with the comprehensive plan, state courts typically find that comprehensive plans are supportive with regard to the community's intent. So integrating hazard priorities directly or by reference into the comprehensive plan is important. For example, the use of the future land use map can help identify potential problems stemming from various densities of development in hazardous areas, such as floodplains. For conservation planning, protecting wildlife migration corridors along rivers and streams not only serves habitat and environmental protection, but also limits development in flood-prone areas. Protecting natural drainage systems during development is a key starting point for public facilities, along with the protection of water treatment facilities, stormwater management, and sewer and solid waste. Critical facilities such as police and fire stations and emergency operations centers should not be located in vulnerable areas. And breakdowns in community transportation systems during disasters are often dramatic and create major dislocations. Therefore, having links between transportation planning and hazard mitigation planning is also essential. So what we are looking at is a chart from a report entitled Achieving Hazard Resilient Coastal and Waterfront Smart Growth. What I like about this chart is that it shows how hazard mitigation and land use planning processes are connected. The columns on the right and left list different strategies, and the middle column identifies potential intersections between them. The color of the boxes indicates how they could potentially complement green or counter yellow the goals of one another during implementation. For example, preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas is a smart growth principle. You can find it in the right column as protect critical environmental areas. It works with hazard mitigation strategies by supporting the protection of hazard-prone and environmentally sensitive areas. Another example is strengthening and directing development towards existing communities. This smart growth strategy counters the hazard mitigation strategy because infill development in a hazard-prone location may actually increase flood risk. Therefore, smart growth and hazard mitigation issues should be addressed through a comprehensive approach. Consider the safety element in the planning process. Create a safe growth vision and establish policies such as locating critical facilities outside high-risk zones, preserving protective ecosystems, and retrofitting buildings and facilities at risk in redeveloping areas. A tool to utilize would be APA's zoning practice, October 2009, issue number 10, entitled Practice Safe Growth Audits. We discussed repetitive loss properties earlier as having to comply with BW12 and the HFIAA. These are policyholders that will be paying the 25% annual rate increases as required by Congress in BW12 and will not be receiving any refunds afforded by the HFIAA. Property acquisitions are an effective mitigation measure to address repetitive flood claims because they are a permanent form of mitigation. FEMA funds are available to states to purchase property in flood-prone areas and dedicate that property as green space, not available for development. This type of project allows local jurisdictions to remove people and property from floodplains and reduces future costs associated with a community's disaster response, recovery, and repair. To be eligible for an increased federal cost share, a FEMA-approved state mitigation plan that addresses repetitive loss properties must be in effect at the time of the grant award, and the property that is being submitted for consideration must be a repetitive loss property. Land use planning and zoning are tools that provide balance to public and private concerns. They work to ensure that one person's activities do not adversely affect others or the general public. Zoning regulates development by dividing a community into zones or districts and setting development criteria for each zone or district. Zoning ordinances have the potential to restrict damage-prone development in hazardous or sensitive areas. For example, the overlay zoning technique is a modification of the system of conventionally mapped zoning districts. An overlay zone applies a common set of standards to a designated area that may cut across several different conventional or underlying zoning districts, with the standards of the overlay zone applying in addition to those of the underlying zoning district. Some common examples of overlay zones are the flood zones administered by many communities under the NFIP, areas of severe slope, a waterfront zone, or an environmentally sensitive area. A floodplain overlay zone regulation could address such matters as the floodproofing of development, elevation of structures, or the anchoring of manufactured homes. Zoning can address appropriate uses in a floodplain, such as low-density residential, no more than one building constructed per acre of floodplain, animal or crop production, horticulture, open recreation, wildlife and game preserves, trails, local utility services, or campgrounds. Zoning can also address buffers, which are vegetated lands adjacent to the stream channel and the drainage basin. They protect the stream's ability to fulfill its natural functions. Buffers have the primary natural functions of protecting water quality by filtering pollutants, providing intermittent storage for floodwaters, allowing channels to meander naturally, and providing suitable habitat for wildlife. There are various ways to incorporate riparian coastal buffers into zoning, such as determining setbacks, zones, or buffer widths, identifying the activities that are permitted, activities that are banned, activities which are regulated, and the procedure for obtaining a permit to build on or around these sensitive areas. Subdivision regulations govern how land will be subdivided into individual lots and set the construction and location standards for the infrastructure the developer builds to serve those lots. This infrastructure includes the new roads, sidewalks, utility lines, storm sewers, and drainage ways that a community usually maintains after the subdivision is approved. Subdivision regulations may allow for the concentration of structures outside the hazard area, called clustering or cluster development. For example, the area to be developed can be clustered on the upland portion of the property, leaving the low-lying features of the floodplain undisturbed. Other provisions can include the ones listed on the screen. FEMA requires through local enforcement that any subdivision or other large development that is greater than 50 lots or 5 acres, whichever is the lesser, be evaluated to determine if the proposed site is in an approximate A zone and whether BFEs are required. If BFEs are required, the developer must conduct the required study. The community, state, or other agency may provide assistance. New developments have the potential of producing serious adverse drainage impacts. This potential occurs anywhere in the watershed, not just in the floodplain. Development outside a floodplain can contribute significantly to flooding problems. Runoff is increased by 10% to over 100% when natural ground cover is replaced by urban development. One of the ways to tackle increased runoff is through green infrastructure. What is green infrastructure? At the regional scale, it is the preservation and restoration of natural landscape features, such as forests, floodplains, and wetlands. Green infrastructure practices on a smaller scale include rain gardens, porous pavements, green roofs, infiltration planters, trees, and tree boxes. Altogether, green infrastructure is a set of management approaches and technologies that utilize, enhance, and/or mimic the natural hydrologic processes of infiltration, evapotranspiration, and water reuse. Tools to assess the friendliness of your community's land use regulations to green infrastructure are the Center for Watershed Protection's Code and Ordinance Worksheet and the EPA's Water Quality Scorecard. Both were developed to help local governments identify opportunities to remove barriers and revise and create codes, ordinances, and incentives to better protect water quality. It guides municipal staff through a review of relevant local codes and ordinances across multiple municipal departments to ensure that these codes work together to support a green infrastructure approach. Site plan review is concerned with how a particular parcel is developed. A site plan shows the arrangement, layout, and design of the proposed use of a single parcel of land. Site plan review can include both small and large-scale proposals, ranging from gas stations, drive-through facilities, and office buildings to complex ones such as shopping centers, apartment complexes, and industrial parks. Site plan review elements related to flooding that could be a good addition to the local ordinance or law would be natural features such as specific soil types, aquifers, infrastructure like sewage, storm drainage, screening and landscaping, landscaping plan, protection of trees, adjacent uses, parking, signs and access, and proposed grades and contours. Consider the role of the Conservation or Environmental Board. In New York, the role of the Conservation or Environmental Board is recognized under General Municipal Law 239. It can be created by the local legislative body to advise in the management and protection of natural resources in the municipality. Some activities include conducting research, keeping inventories, providing public education, and preparing and distributing printed materials. Lastly, standards of approval that are flood-related could ask such questions as, is there disturbance or removal of the natural vegetation in the floodplain? Does the design or land contours and choice of plant materials direct surface runoff away from the structures? Is there surface runoff onto neighboring properties? Consider the location and design of the off-street parking and or loading requirements, impervious cover in relation to the floodplain. Is there an evacuation plan for the development in periods of major flooding? And consider the design and placement of the water supply and on and off-site sewage systems. The NFIP's minimum requirements are just that, minimums. The minimums set construction standards that often do not provide sufficient protection from all local hazards, nor do they account for the effects of urbanization on future flood levels. They will allow floodwater conveyance areas to be reduced, essentially valley storage to be filled, or velocities to be increased, all of which can adversely affect others in the floodplain and watershed. It is important that local communities recognize the need to go beyond national and state minimums and take charge of their own flooding issues. First, prohibit fill in the 100-year floodplain or the flood fringe. Compensatory storage. Development, including fill, is allowed in A zones outside of floodways. When fill or buildings are placed in the flood fringe, the flood storage areas are lost, and flood heights will go up because there is less room for the floodwaters. This is particularly important in smaller watersheds, which respond sooner to changes in the topography. One approach that may be used to address this issue is to require compensatory storage to offset any loss of flood storage capacity. Add a definition for critical facilities, consistent with the definition found in the local hazard mitigation plan, and require that, to the extent possible, critical facilities be located outside of the special flood hazard area, preferably outside the 0.2% annual chance flood, or the 500-year. If located within the SFHA, require that development and submittal of a flood emergency plan that describes how the facility will function during the base flood. Add a definition for hazardous materials consistent with building code, and require that, to the extent possible, use, storage, and disposal of hazardous materials be located outside of the special flood hazard area, preferably outside the 0.2% annual chance flood. If located within the SFHA, require that hazardous materials be located above the flood protection level or stored and used in a manner that prevents pollution during a base flood. You can also designate the 1% annual chance flood zone or the 100-year floodplain as the floodway. Lastly, the NFIP's substantial improvement regulations allow each improvement project valued at up to 50% of the building's pre-improvement value to be permitted without meeting the flood protection requirements. Over the years, a community may issue a succession of permits or different repairs or improvements to the same structures. This can greatly increase the overall flood damage potential. To counter this, some communities count improvements cumulatively, so that when the total value of all improvements or repairs permitted over the years, life of a structure, or 10 to 20 years, exceeds 50%, the original building must be protected according to new building requirements. A variation is to have a lower threshold for substantial improvements to less than 50%. Design guidelines provide flexibility but make a clear statement of intent. This tool might be useful if ponding and poor drainage is a source of flooding in your community. So have design guidelines that address green infrastructure and/or low-impact development, LID. LID is an approach to land development that works with nature to manage stormwater as close to its source as possible. Guidelines are often a kinder, gentler way to introduce planning and design elements to the public. Usually, guidelines allows some discretion or wiggle room to use conventional techniques. Overall, it's a good education and outreach tool. The more pictures, the better. Design standards, on the contrary, are usually found within the ordinance itself, such as zoning. So some general recommendations for a design guidelines document focusing on green infrastructure would be to show how native vegetation assists with water efficiency, rain barrels and disconnection of rooftop runoff, permeable pavers and asphalt concrete, which reduces runoff, shared driveways or two strips or ribbons of concrete that reduces the amount of impervious cover. Overall, using stormwater management features such as gutters, downspouts, and cisterns, as well as site topography and vegetation to contribute to the site's sustainability. Preparing design guidelines for hazardous areas is another idea and could complement the flood damage prevention ordinance. So this concludes my presentation. I'd like to thank the New York Upstate Chapter APA for this opportunity, and we can open up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamie. Our first question comes from John. What was the 5-acre subdivision review about again?
Let me refer back to my notes. Though that regulation is part of the minimum NFIP standards, and I will read that again when I'm able to find them in my notes. Okay, here it is. Sorry about that. FEMA requires through local enforcement that any subdivision or other large development that is greater than 50 lots or 5 acres, whichever is the lesser, be evaluated to determine if the proposed site is in an approximate A zone and whether BFEs are required. So usually it's in an unmarked A zone where the BFEs have not been defined. So the standard is 50 lots or 5 acres, and usually this is part of the minimum NFIP standards.
Great. Our next question comes from Shane. It is his understanding that you cannot do any sort of digging in the river areas. How can you excavate a floodable area in exchange for filling in another area?
I guess that comes down to the local permitting requirements that may not be required by the local permitting authority. It may or may not be. Depends on what their local laws state.
Our next question is from Armando. To what extent do you include climate change in your regional planning?
Could you repeat that again? I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. To what extent do you include climate change in your regional planning?
That is a great question. We've actually, through New York State, the entire state has gone through a regional sustainability process, and the Genesee Finger Lakes region has a sustainability plan in which climate change is addressed.
Great. Our next question is from Carlos. What is the protocol involving existing public housing within a flood hazard area? Specifically, who pays for the insurance rate increases?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I don't know that answer offhand, but again, I refer everyone to go to FEMA's website and their resource and document library, and there's quite a few different fact sheets that you can download. If you type in Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act or the HFIAA, it'll take you to a page where you can download, again, various brochures and materials that will give you exactly what different rates will be, at what time they will occur, and a lot of that very specific information that I don't have right at hand, but that you can get more detailed information for.
Great. Our next question is from Chris involving takings. If an entire lot is platted and then the floodway is reclassified to encompass the entire lot, is that considered a takings?
Well, again, it goes back to my slide talking about fact-finding. It really depends on what can be shown. If there's reasonable, if it's reasonable, not allowing that activity to occur. If a municipality or local government can show that there is substantial evidence for not permitting a certain type of development to occur, then again the courts have favorably looked upon those types of decisions favorably in terms of the local government's decision. But again, it really needs to come down to having that substantial evidence for not allowing whatever the activity is to not occur. So again, that's why it's so important to have all that data, even beyond what the flood insurance rate map gives you, because it may not be completely correct for your local municipality, whereas the local folks, the boots on the ground folks, they know their community really well. So to collect that data and have it as part of substantial evidence for those permitting activities is so crucial.
This next question is from Leslie, and it's in regards to rain gardens and other installed LID measures. Has anyone looked at the long-term maintenance and preservation of rain gardens? They're concerned that they can easily be removed or undone without any review, just as someone can add impervious cover to their site at any time without review.
That's a good point. I know in a lot of cases, in terms of subdivisions, rain gardens are sometimes being proposed as the stormwater management technique that's being utilized. And a lot of times homeowners may not be aware that that rain garden is not just a garden, it's actually part of the stormwater management system for the subdivision, which was required by the developer to put in, by the municipality to the developer to put in. So I think it comes down to having that education with the residents, and also I've heard of maintenance agreements being part of the regulation process, and so that there is an understanding of who's to take care of that green infrastructure practice in the long term, since they are more maintenance required than the traditional stormwater techniques of stormwater ponds, such as stormwater ponds. So including all that type of information as whether part of your application process or the local laws that you have to you can really allow that cross dialogue to occur.
This question is about communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. Is it counterproductive to offer flood insurance to properties in the flood hazard areas? Should planners instead encourage communities to not join the NFIP in order to discourage new development in floodplains?
No, I mean, basically, if the community doesn't adopt the flood damage prevention law, and which along with comes with the flood insurance rate map, then you cannot offer flood insurance to residents in your community. And having flood insurance is mandatory if you do have a federally backed mortgage, if you carry a federally backed mortgage, which most homeowners, I imagine, would have. So I think it's an extreme disservice to not be a part, not participate in the NFIP. Speaking on that note, I think what needs to occur is not only participating in the NFIP, but communities need to be more proactive. So in a way that you can do that is through the CRS program, which is a voluntary program, and it enables local governments to implement higher standards in terms of floodplain management in return to lower cost flood insurance to residents in their community. So I think communities really need to participate more in the NFIP, and again through the CRS program, the Community Rating Systems program.
This next question is in regards to federal agencies and floodplains. Jocelyn is wondering if federal agencies have to adhere to the National Floodplain Program requirements, or are they exempt? She knows of a local federal agency that constructed their new office inside a floodplain.
Well, I imagine they do, and I mean, I guess I can speak directly to, I know that in New York State, state agencies need to follow the local floodplain ordinances of the communities in which they work in. So for example, if the Department of Transportation is doing a roadway construction in a community that has, in a floodplain, special flood hazard area in a particular community, they need to adhere to the local municipalities' local laws or flood damage prevention laws, and basically file a permit with that local municipality. That also, state schools are also need to get a permit at the local level as well. So I can at least speak to New York State. I know I know it doesn't happen often, and I think that's why where local governments that have this on the books need to reacquaint themselves with the actual law and make sure they're enforcing it correctly.
This next question is about homes in a community outside the flood hazard areas. Within a community that's participating in the FIP, do homes outside the hazard areas, are they allowed to purchase flood insurance with the federal insurance subsidies?
They can purchase flood insurance, and that the only residents that are required to purchase flood insurance are those that are in the special flood hazard area, which is the 1% annual chance, or the 100-year. If you look at a flood insurance rate map, you'll also see zone X's, shaded zone X's, which are the 0.2% annual chance flood or the 500-year floodplain. And in those areas, flood residents are not required to purchase flood insurance, but of course they're highly encouraged, and that would go for others that are even located outside in an unshaded zone X, which they're basically not in a floodplain at all. And I would imagine the policy premiums are fairly low because you're not in an active or high-risk area. So it's encouraged to do so, especially if again, you know the maps are wrong in the area, because it's not always the case where the firms are accurate. So I think, again, that's where collecting the local data and just knowing the local conditions in your community and what areas are more susceptible to flooding.
So our final question today comes from Marilyn. How is environmental justice considered in repairs or home improvements for single-family property owners? Often lower-income persons have homes in flood hazard areas.
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, and I imagine there are likely programs out there, maybe at the local level, county level, that might have different assistance programs, especially with trying to bring buildings into compliance in flood hazard areas. I guess I would, it's something that would likely happen at the local level, and it may actually be an area of opportunity to include those types of projects or incentives or programs when communities get together and do their local hazard mitigation plan. At least in my region, we have the counties do a multi-hazard mitigation plan at the county level, and incorporating those types of mitigation programs is an excellent way to cover social inequality and justice programs in those types of planning processes.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank Jamie and Arthur for this presentation today, and thank all the participants. Again, if you'd like to learn more about upcoming webinars, please visit utah-apa.com for more webcasts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.